Waldy and Bendy.
Hello and welcome to the podcast they couldn't stop, Waldy and Bendy's Adventures in Art. I'm Varwain Ustak, art critic of the Sunday Times in London, and I'm joined at the wheel of this artistic bumper car by a man they call the Chameleon. And why do they call him that? Because no one knows for sure what he'll be tomorrow. Sometimes he's an art historian, sometimes a dealer, sometimes an art detective, and sometimes, just sometimes, he's riding around Britain on a motorbike wearing tight black leathers. Dr. Bendel Grosvenor, am I imagining this, or did I used to see you on TV programmes dressed as a Hell's Angel?
It's been some time, well, since I wore the tight leathers, I must confess, and I'm sure that disappoints many of our listeners and viewers. It's also been some time since I was an art dealer, so what's left of your chameleon repertoire? I think I'm just an art historian, and that's about it.
You can't move on from the tight leather trousers and the motorbike as quickly as that. I mean, I actually glimpsed you again in that guise the other day on some repeat on the telly. What was all that about? You just don't strike me as one of life's natural bikers. I mean, obviously there's something deep within. What's your bike story?
The bike story is I've had lots of motorbikes. I had one of those Indian jobs, the Royal Enfield. They used to make them in India. I still do, I think. And then I had Harley Davidsons for some time. And then I had, what did I have? A Triumph. All sorts of bikes, Wild. And people used to stop me and say, can I come and have a go on the back of your bike? In fact, that was one of the lines which first got me talking to my now wife, Ishbel.
I knew it.
Wild, I'm waiting and I'm ready to take you on the back of the bike sometime, so just say the word.
I think we're more of the Wallace and Gromit turn up. I think it's you on the bike and me in the sidecar. I can't really see myself striding on the back of a bike with you. But no, it's very exciting. I mean, I have never ridden a bike properly, so I'm very impressed. And listen, I've just been to Venice, where of course you can't take motorbikes. You have to go around everywhere by boat. But I had a fabulous time. I was there popping in and out of churches for the best part of a week, really. And it was so exciting. You know, you were talking the other day about Naples, how important it is to see art in its context. Well, of course, Venice is perhaps the best place on earth to do that, really, because so many of its best pictures are still inside the churches and the places for which they were made. But I slightly changed my tack this time, right? Usually, I don't know about you, but when I go to Venice, usually I look up the great painters and I find their work, Tintoretto, Titian. Is that what you do?
No, I just like to wander around, pop in randomly from church to church. There's always something to surprise you.
Yeah, well, indeed there is. And so this time anyway, I decided to follow the saints. So what I did was I went on, because I love the stories of the saints, how each of them pops up in so many altarpieces. And there's enormous fun to be had trying to identify them. Because the whole point of these busy altarpieces is that if you've got a Virgin Mary and Jesus in the middle, but they're surrounded by saints painted by Lorenzo Lotto or Cima da Conegliano, knowing who the saints are is a large part of the pleasure. And of course, I'm now pretty experienced at that. I've made programs about them and I've looked at them a lot. And I found it a really enjoyable way to go around because you aren't looking for great painters. You're looking for identifiers of saints. I tick them all off. It was a bit like bird watching. You can get a book of saints and put a tick next to each one you've seen. St. Lucy, St. Dorothy, St. Agnes, etc. I recommend it as a process. All those people who are going to be coming to Venice this year, try it out. Find a book about the saints and go and visit the churches. What do you think of that, Bendy?
It sounds lovely, and we should do a Who's That Saint soon. And I would like to come with you on your private, personal Riva motorboat as you toodle around the lagoon looking at the saints. So save a space for me, please.
I will, Bendy, and I'm just enjoying this little bit glass of Italian Prosecco that I brought back from Venice, which is very tasty, I must say. I know you don't drink yourself, and I'm not a big drinker, but occasionally a glass of Venetian Prosecco is what the world needs in order to open the doorways of art, don't you think?
Yeah, especially at 9 a.m.
It's not, yes, okay, especially at 9 a.m. There's never a time when it's too early for Prosecco, you know that. Even as a former biker, you must know that. So anyway, talking of Hell's Angels, Bendy, later in the podcast, we'll be investigating a crucial art topic, which is how artists through the ages have imagined the devil. I mean, for some, he's a tall art historian on a motorbike, but for others, I'll just wait and see. There's devils galore coming up, Bendy. First, though, a recommendation.
Go, go, go and see this show.
Bendy. So I've been along to the National Gallery here in London, which all our visitors listening in America must know pretty well if they've been here. All those visitors from Ohio and Montana and West Virginia. Right in the middle of London, we have one of the finest galleries in the world. It's an amazing collection. And they have a show at the moment devoted to, I know, one of your heroes, the great horse painter, George Stubbs, a significant 18th century English painter. And the show is a very intriguing little event, which casts two of his best-known pictures, I suppose, next to each other, although they're actually not in the same space. They're separated, one at one end of the gallery, the other at the other end. But they're a kind of exploration of George Stubbs's giant horse painting. So the two biggest paintings he did. So one is Whistlejacket, which of course you know, and the other, I don't know if you know or not, it's called Scrub, of a horse called Scrub.
And I think this is only the second time Scrub has ever been seen in public. That's part of the point of the show, isn't it? It's still in the private collection of the descendant of the Marquis of Rockingham, who commissioned both pictures, Whistlejacket and Scrub, along with about a dozen others from Stubbs back in the day in the 1760s, for his giant house called Wentworth Woodhouse. And Scrub still belongs to the family.
Indeed. And as you said, Scrub has been very rarely seen, only once before, and he's on show here in this small but incredibly potent exhibition in one of the temporary galleries at the National Gallery. And he's big. My word, he's big. I mean, you say that the Rockingham country house is big. It would need to be to fit this thing in. Absolutely massive. So near as damn, life-size, rearing horse. And you walk in, and it is like walking into a cinema. Right in front of you is this gigantic picture of this Lone Ranger posing horse, rearing up on its back legs. Very spectacular. And around it, a smaller but very intriguing show devoted to Stubbs's horse painting. There's art, for example, there's some lovely drawings and early prints from his great book on the anatomy of a horse. So those are on show. And a couple of smaller paintings of his, which I think are there to show something quite interesting about him, which is he had a way of, no matter which horse he painted, he had a way of somehow identifying or seeing its personality. And you see it, horses with a definite feel to it. And you get that as well in these two big pictures, the stars of the event. One in the National Gallery collection permanently, the other on loan, facing each other off across the gallery, one rearing up one way, the other rearing the other. Very dramatic. But what you really see here, I think, is two things. One, what a damn good horse painter he was. I mean, just all that anatomy prepared him so well for these incredibly realistic evocations of a horse's body. And we can discuss, I think, in a moment, which one was a better painting. I have my own rather surprising views, actually. And, of course, Whistlejacket is on a blank background, so it doesn't seem to have a landscape or anything behind it. It could almost be like a statue on a pedestal. Whereas Scrub has this beautiful landscape behind him, painted by Stubbs, apparently, according to the curator. So that's interesting. So he's set in a landscape, so it's a different feel, but still very beautiful. But the big mystery, right, and you know all about this, Bendy, the big mystery for me is why both these paintings originally were meant to have a king sitting on the back of the horse, right? George III was meant to appear riding both these horses in a heroic pose, and yet in both cases, he's not there. Now, what on earth is that about? Where did George III get redacted and why?
The way I understand it is that George III was only meant to be riding one. And in my view, that's Whistlejacket. So art historians and the National Gallery have got themselves into all sorts of knots as to why Whistlejacket is unfinished. And I believe Horace Walpole, who's the great art historian in the 18th century, who actually went to see the painting in 1772. So this is within a decade of it being painted. And he is told that Whistlejacket was left unfinished because it was supposed to have George III riding on the back. And the reason George III was never put on the back, and the reason why the background was left unfinished, is because the Marquis of Rockingham, who was Prime Minister briefly in 1765, then goes into opposition and feels far less reason to flatter and enamour George III by plonking him on his favourite racehorse, painted by his favourite horse painter, George Stubbs. So the commission never finally gets completed. That's my reading of it anyway.
Well, there is a complication because in the show, right, I mean, all of that you say so far is true. In other words, it's meant to have George III on it. For some reason, it didn't end up with George III. So it's just the horse with this plain background. which just on its own is a very revolutionary thing, isn't it? I mean, you do not expect in the 18th century to see something looking quite so modern, a horse taken out of context, just as it were, rearing up in empty space almost. And what the curator told me, which I must say intrigued me, is that apparently there were other horse paintings that Rockingham owned, the Marquis of Rockingham, which also had a plain background. And the suggestion the curator made was that perhaps Rockingham actually liked these plain backgrounds, and he was the one that insisted on it. But the other point that's made is that the second horse, the scrub version, was also meant to have the king on it. In other words, that they were both supposed to have George III riding on them, and both ended up without him. Both may well have ended up without him for the reasons that you outline, which is that Rockingham became Prime Minister, fell out with the king, and he was a Whig anyway, wasn't he? A leading Whig. And of course, he would have fallen out with the Tories. For some reason, there were two goes at it, which I find absolutely mysterious. I would so love to know what really went on. Very intriguing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think really the reason that he's left off and the reason the background is not completed highlights that our understanding of the development of landscape backgrounds in paintings like this is slightly misunderstood. And I'll tell you why. We think that it's perfectly natural for an artist like Stubbs or any English painter of the mid-18th century to paint a natural landscape background of the kind that you see in Scrub. So this is a sort of view of a lake with English oak trees and elms all in the background. But actually, if you're around in the 1760s, this would have been itself quite a novel thing. Because most landscapes at the time were not supposed to be of England. And this sounds rather counterintuitive to us today. The poet William Cowper comes up with a lovely phrase which typifies the taste amongst these kind of art buying and art commissioning elites at the time. He says he's used to going into stately homes and he sees so much Italian light on English walls. So there wasn't actually much demand to have landscapes of England at the time. And oddly enough, this is the time Stubbs is starting his career, 1760s. And even then, there wasn't much demand to have natural English landscape settings for your horse. Now, in time, as Stubbs demonstrated, to have a horse bred in Yorkshire posing as if it's strutting around the Roman Campagna looks completely ridiculous. But that's what they used to do in the 1720s, 1730s and onwards. Until Stubbs comes along and he paints horses so realistically, and we can talk about his studies of the horse anatomy in a moment if you like, but he paints horses so realistically that it only makes sense to have them in a realistic English landscape setting. So that's one of the reasons why Stubbs, in my view, is basically one of the fathers of English landscape painting. Now, if we go back to the Marquis of Rockingham and the 1760s, the early 1760s, and his desire to put George III on the back of a horse, there are other pictures at the time that George Stubbs, he just paints the horse. So this is quite conventional at the time for Stubbs to come along as the leading horse painter, paint the horse, someone else to do the background, and in this case it would have been someone else, I think the idea was for Joshua Reynolds, to paint George III and put him on the horse. So you actually get quite a few moments in these early Stubbs where someone else comes and paints the landscape background. And one of those actually we know belonged to the Marquis of Rockingham. And we can put an image of it on the YouTube channel, ZCZ Films. And you can see one of the Marquis of Rockingham's horse. It's called Samson, right? And it's in a landscape setting, which is painted by someone else, probably George Barrett. But it's an Italian landscape setting. And it looks completely ridiculous. So I think we are used to thinking that Stubbs painted everything, all parts of the picture himself. And later on in the 1770s and 1780s, he does. But at the beginning, he doesn't. It was perfectly normal for him to be asked to just paint the horse and for someone else to come along and paint the background.
Yeah, that sounds very intriguing. So the mystery only deepens, therefore, as to why the background of Scrub, which, as you say, is an English landscape, it's sort of misty, foggy, looks like Stansted Airport before you take off on a foggy day, that was apparently painted by Stubbs. So that is his landscape. So in that instance, he did do it, and yet in this other instance, at what must have been pretty much exactly the same time, right? He didn't do it. So that I feel that has to have some play in this reason why one picture ended up one way, one the other. Perhaps perhaps the absence of a landscape, in the case of Whistlejacket, was there, or rather it wasn't there, because they were waiting for someone else to do it. And in the meantime, he paints another one where he doesn't need anybody else because he does it himself, or something strange like that. It's very mysterious, isn't it?
Yeah, because I don't think Scrub was ever intended to have George III stuck on the back.
Well, no, they say he was, you see.
No, I think that's wrong.
Well, this is the curators. They say that he was, and this is what makes it even more complicated. Because the pose of the rearing horse, I mean, definitely demands someone sitting on the back. I mean, you need the Lone Ranger on the back of Tonto, don't you, to make that image work? So I can see their point there. I mean, I think there was space. But I'll tell you what interested me, right? So I had a good look at Whistlejacket. I mean, one of the great things about this show, right, is you can go from Whistlejacket in the permanent collection, and then stride across the gallery and go and see this other horse in another room, slightly on the other side. And you can compare them. And Whistlejacket, two things stood out for me. One, that Stubbs was indeed this great painter of horses' personalities, because Whistlejacket is this nervy, nostrily, anxious-looking horse. I mean, if you look at his face, I mean, I don't want to be too anthropomorphic about it, but he does look as if he's a highly strung horse and would well have thrown George III, the Mad King, off his back, given a chance. Also, his coloration is interesting. I mean, I described it in my Sunday Times article as a palomino, which I always understood as a sort of golden brown horse with a white tail and white mane, which this is what Whistlejacket has. But there are some people say he's actually just a chestnut. But whatever the coloration is, the point is he's a more playful colour. And the whole idea of a golden brown horse with a white mane and a white tail, I mean, that's like a My Little Pony toy, isn't it? More than a serious horse for a king to be riding. Whereas Scrub, he's this deep chocolate brown, this sort of almost heading for black. I mean, he looks like a mighty steed. You can see a king sitting on the front of him at the beginning of a battle or two. And also, do you know what? I thought Scrub, weirdly, unexpectedly, was the better painted work. Now, Whistlejacket, if you look carefully, I mean, he's very romantic. He's a pretty horse. He's got those palomino colours. If you look at his sides, they're just not sculpted with the same degree of care and realism as Scrub. And my theory looking at it was that maybe because he's meant to have George III sitting on him, that would have covered up the side bit, which which is where the legs of the king would have gone. Stubbs didn't bother as much. Whereas Scrub, really, you can feel the sinews, the tendons, the blood vessels, all perfectly painted in this fantastic capturing of the sheen of the horse's skin and fur. Absolutely fabulous painting. I honestly came out thinking, wow, that is a better painting than Whistlejacket.
Yeah, I think you've absolutely nailed it. I think the reason a Whistlejacket has that slightly plain middle compared to the equivalent of Scrub is, as you say, because he was going to have a saddle on and some royal leg slithering down the side. And if you look at the little shadow under the hooves of Whistlejacket, it's very cursorily put on. It's waiting for a sort of more firmly planted area of ground for him to be rearing in. So it's very interesting to hear your powers of observation there, Weld. I think it confirms my thesis about the painting.
Well, listen, no one's ever going to not confirm it because nobody knows, right? It's an intriguing situation. I absolutely recommend people go and see the show.
One of the reasons I feel quite strongly about this, actually, is that we have two early sources from within Stubbs' lifetime, one of which is himself, saying this is what happened about the painting. So what I think is so interesting is that art historians have wanted to kind of art historicize the whole story. And that is to say, for example, that the Marquess of Rockingham wanted to leave it unfinished because it suited his neoclassical tastes, and he collected Greek statues, and it made a painting look more like a Greek statue. I just think it's unfinished because it's unfinished. And that's that.
Well, people, listeners from far away, come to London, go and see the show. It's on until, when is it? Sort of May, end of May. Go and see it. You'll be astonished by the quality of the horse painting, and also you'll be able to argue with Bendy or me about what you think happened to the missing king. So that's a fabulous show at the National Gallery here in London. But we're going to move on, Bendy. One of the things that happened to me in Venice as I was going around looking for the saints was that I also found quite a few devils knocking around, because wherever you've got saints in art, you've also got devils. And there's a particularly interesting one by an artist called Bonifacio di Pittati. Have you heard of Bonifacio di Pittati before?
I haven't. Did he like chips?
You're thinking of Bonifacio di Chipati. No, Pittati, he liked pita bread now. He was believe it or not, he was actually called Bonifacio Veronese a lot of the time until the other Veronese knocked him out of the water. But he was a contemporary of Palma the Elder, and also of Titian. So he was an early 16th century Venetian painter. And his masterpiece is this fantastic view of St. Michael, the archangel, tossing the devil out of heaven. And it hangs in the Basilica of San Giovanni e Paolo in Venice. And I sort of missed it. I've been doing this film recently about how the image of the devil changed. And I wish I'd seen this before because I would have put it in. I'll tell you what, though, it's a hell of a story.
Tales of the Art World.
So yes, Bendy, the Basilica of San Giovanni e Paolo in Venice, I go in and I find this amazing picture of the devil being thrust out of heaven by an angry St. Michael wielding a sword. Fantastic picture. And the devil is very devilish. By that I mean he's got horns, an ugly face, he's got scales, he looks reptilian. He more or less fits the idea of what we think the devil may look like. But in the course of making this film I did, in my series called Art's Most, I did one about horrific things in art, and I did one about satanic things in art. I came to realize something crucial, which is that pretty much every society there's ever been has had at some point or other to invent or put a face to ideas of evil and wickedness, because they've always been aware of it. We've all somehow or other instinctively known that there is this thing called evil or wickedness around. But we don't know what it looks like, do we? And if we're trying to paint pictures and make art out of it, we have to put a face to it. So in every society there's been, people have had to come up with assortments of demons. And our society, which is basically Western society, is no different. And what a story it is. I mean, basically it is one of art's great subjects. It's not talked about much, but it's so important how art basically invented the devil. Can you kick us off on that? It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you really can say art invents the devil, at least largely helps invent the devil. I mean, literature plays a role. And of course, people will say, but doesn't the Bible play a role? But that's the interesting thing about it. Do you think we should start off by saying that the devil, his place in the Bible is actually really vague and uncertain? You might think that the devil emerges fully formed in the Bible, as God does. I mean, God is right there in the beginning, isn't he? In Genesis, line 1, chapter 1, in the beginning God created the earth. But it takes us a great deal of time to actually get some form of the devil. I mean, people might think that the devil is the serpent in the Garden of Eden, tempting Eve with the apple, but actually that's just a serpent at first, and it's only later on in the Christian tradition that it becomes the devil, isn't that right?
Exactly. And there are no descriptions of the devil in the Bible. And there is no single passage that says, he looked like this, he looked like this, he looked like this, or she looked like this, she looked like that. There are obviously sort of references that, because the Bible, its great strength is that it can be interpreted in any manner of wonderful ways. There are references that can be taken to describe the devil in some form or other, broken form, but there's nothing specific, nothing concrete. So yes, art has had to come up with this idea.
Well, in the book of Revelation, we get the one-word description of a great dragon, that old serpent called the devil and Satan. But it's not terribly specific, but it gives you something for artists to get their teeth into later on, doesn't it?
Well, it does, but it doesn't always mean that the devil had to look like that. So, I mean, one of the big influences on imagery of the devil was, of course, Milton's great Paradise Lost, which is this thunderous tale, a fabulous 17th century poem that details how Lucifer, who was the most beautiful of the angels, succumbed to the great sin of pride and thought he was more beautiful or as beautiful as God himself, as Jesus. And so, of course, he gets thrown out of heaven, and the fallen angel, as he becomes, is this beautiful figure who is first of all called Beelzebub, then Lucifer, and then eventually we think of him as the devil. And again, the devil has so many faces, it's never quite clear who's who. What's the difference between Beelzebub and Lucifer? It's hard to tell. But what's interesting for me is how certain artists painted Lucifer as this very hunky, beautiful figure, which gets thrown out because it's so proud of itself, because he thinks he's so beautiful, because he thinks he's a match for Christ. And there's a painting by Alexandre Cabanel, which hangs in Montpellier in the Musée Fabre, which I know is probably the museum's most famous and certainly the most postcard-friendly picture, because everybody's always buying it. I don't know if you know it, but it shows a naked Lucifer, presumably on the verge of being chucked out of heaven, because the angels around him are fluttering about. You feel that one of them's going to grab hold of him and kick him out in a minute. But he is such a hunk. I mean, he's got this beautiful body. I mean, even more Adonis-like than you, Bendor. And he's leaning back with his angels, beautiful wings crumpled up behind him. And he's staring over his arm with this look of kind of anger and regret. And if you look really, really carefully at the picture, you see he's got a tear coming down from his eye. So it's a very sensitive portrayal and doesn't look at all demonic in any way that you and I would probably imagine it. It was painted by Cabanel in 1847. It was actually painted in Rome because he was a winner of the Prix de Rome, you know, this major prize they had in the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. If you won a big prize as a student, you got sent to Rome for a few years and you could paint Roman things. So he painted it in Rome when he's 24 years old, this famous Lucifer, the fallen angel. And I think that it's above all influenced by something very specific. Can you think what that might be? He's in Rome, he's 24 years old, he's very impressionable. What might he be really influenced by in his painting of the devil?
Something from Michelangelo or a neoclassical statue.
Oh, I think it must be Michelangelo, yeah. It must be the Sistine ceiling because, as you know, the Sistine ceiling has these famous figures on it called the Ignudi, the nudes, and they are Michelangelo's version of an angel. And, of course, for Michelangelo, it was incredibly important that angels didn't, in fact, have wings and weren't beautiful androgynous figures with long golden hair and wore white dresses. They were naked guys, bullish, tough, and we could be sure of that because in the scene of the Last Judgment that hangs on the far wall of the Sistine Chapel, the angels who are trumpeting in the end of the world, which again, from the book of Revelation, we know that when the angels start trumpeting, that's our moment up. The angels there have no wings. They're just naked, big guys floating about in the sky. So Michelangelo's revolutionary, and it has to say, rather controversial idea was that angels were just human beings who happened to be, blessed with a perfect Bendel Grosvenor type of body. And I think that sort of influence went into this painting by Cabanel. When I was filming it, all the women in the crew loved it. I mean, he's a real hunk. He's the sort of guy who you put him in black leathers and a helmet and he'd be on a motorbike. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, it's a fine and handsome picture. And you started, in a way, the story at the end of our chronology in the middle of the 19th century. But oddly enough, although there would have been no artists around technically to render the Adonis-like physique of Satan in this picture back in the early Christian period, I think if you had been, say, a Christian in the year, 400 or 500 AD, and you had been asked to imagine Satan, this is not unlike the sort of figure you might have imagined. This idea, this concept of the fallen angel, someone who was beautiful and pure in a way with their angelic wings, who has nonetheless succumbed to evil and has been cast out of heaven. Can I take us to another image? This is something from the 9th century, okay, so we're talking about the 800s, and it's an illustration of Satan from a Bible or a Psalter called the Stuttgart Psalter or the Stuttgart Gospels, and it's currently in, and I'm going to impress you with my German accent here, it's currently in the Württembergische Landesbibliothek in Stuttgart, and it is a representation of one of Jesus' miracles, right? And it's one of Jesus' miracles when he's casting the demons or the devils out of various people in his ministry. In this case, I think it's the someone who is mute, and Jesus casts out the demons and he can speak again. And in this representation of that miracle, we see in the left-hand side one of these very, very early representations of the devil who's looking on aghast. Now, it's difficult to see that this devil, this Satan, is hunky, but he's naked, and he's got his wings. But what's interesting is he's relatively normal, right? So he's got none of the stereotypical things that we might think of as appearing for an image of Satan in this distant past. No hooves, no scales, none of that business. He just looks like a normal person with a beard. He's got his wings, but his attribute, what's clearly marking him out as the devil, is the serpent or the snake that he's got wrapped around his arms. But
Mm.
I think this is just so interesting because it gives us a glimpse into how people represented Satan long before we got carried away in art with the idea of having to make him this kind of terrifying dragon-like creature.
And he's got wings coming out of his head. That's very revolutionary as well, isn't it? When you first sent this to me, Bendy, and I don't know this work and I haven't seen it before, but Jesus appears to be grabbing the boob of a naked woman. Is this the deaf or blind person that he's curing or throwing the devil out of? I mean, it's a fairly risky image of Jesus, particularly for the 9th century.
No, I think it's just a representation of a male torso, actually. Which,
Do you?
Yeah, and it's the miracle of the mute man. So we're talking about
Okay.
chapter 11. Yeah.
That's my modern mind misreading things, as the modern mind often does. No, but yes, the devil. See, a lot of the features that we now think of as the devil's features were only borrowed much later, weren't they? And a lot of them came, of course, as all these things do, came from classical antiquity. So, we know that one of the things this devil hasn't got is horns, right? And the horns are a later addition, probably derived from the god Pan, right? And very, very naughty satyr, the cloven feet, all that kind of stuff is yet to come. Because it's such a challenge, isn't it? I mean, this is the wondrous thing about art. You don't know what it is you're meant to describe, but it needs to be legible for your audience. The audience needs to know that this is the devil. What on earth, if before any of these things are standardized and finished, what on earth do you do to this figure to make it absolutely clear who he is? It's a fascinating process, isn't it?
Yep, and you got the serpent here. But Weld, I think if I could move us on to our next image. Now, this is something I've chosen. It's from the about 1400, okay? And it's a representation in a book which is called the Weltchronik. And this was originally a German text which was written by someone called Rudolf von Ems. And it was this idea of bringing in biblical texts and classical stories and all part of sort of an illustrated history of the world. I don't know if you remember, but when I was at school, there was this thing called the Chronicle of the History of the World, which was a very popular book for school kids. And this was a sort of a predecessor of that.
Marvel Comics for me, I'm afraid. But yeah, a similar thing, though. Oh, there are plenty of Superman in that as well.
Yeah, but it's very interesting because the representation of the devil here, we've got an illustration of the story of the book of Job. We'll come on to what the story of Job is all about in a moment, but the point is the devil here, he's definitely moving on from the humanoid features we've been discussing so far. So he's a biped, he's standing up, but he's got a tail, and he's got forked fingers and cloven feet, and he's got pointy ears, and he's clearly very ugly, and he's lost his wings. So he's evolving into a kind of ghoulish, terrible, horrifying figure. And we see here two scenes from the story of Job. And the story of Job is really interesting for the history of the devil itself. Because in the story of the book of Job, Job's faith is tested by God by taking away all his worldly possessions. And in one of the things where he's most tested is when the devil, Satan, who interestingly in the Old Testament is not a kind of anti-God figure at this point. He's actually sort of working with God to test Job's faith. So he's still sort of in the heavenly realm in a way. But in this representation of Satan smiting Job, we see Job lying down on the floor and he's got all these red boils on his flesh. And this is the moment when Satan smites him with the terrible disease. And in the Bible, the disease is not stated. But you can see from the image that actually we are now moving into the point where this is the moment where the image and the story of the devil is really turbocharged in medieval history because we are in the world of the Black Death, Wild. And if you had the Black Death and you had the plague, which had wiped out between a third and half the population of Europe, if you got the plague, this is what happened. You had these red buboses appeared all over your flesh. The story of Job and the devil's role within it, as you can imagine, becomes much more popular and represented in art at the time. And the devil, in order to fit the time, the cataclysmic, awful impact of the plague, the devil's image is made more horrible. And so we're seeing that in this representation here.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because if you think about it, right, I mean, I was brought up as a Catholic, so I remember all those sermons when the priest would stand up on the pulpit and tell you all these terrible things that were going to happen to you in hell if you sinned, and describe these fires and destruction and awful creature, the devil. But if you think about it, right, the devil would work much better if he wasn't immediately ugly and horrible, if he genuinely could tempt you because he was beautiful and you didn't know it was the devil. This is the sort of Faustian idea that you can't actually know who he is because he's a shapeshifter. Before all you know, I could be the devil, you could be the devil, and we're not going to have horns and a tail and dragon's wings. We could be anybody. And I love that shape-shifting aspect of the devil because apart from anything else, it's given art an enormous freedom and range because in different situations, they can imagine the devil in different ways and from a different perspective. And if you look at, there's the story of Job indeed becomes this kind of Baroque favourite, doesn't it? Do you remember I was talking about an exhibition in Paris a few months ago now on the podcast of the paintings of Georges de la Tour? And he did a painting where Job is being mocked by his wife. Now, the wife, watches all this temptation raining in on Job. She sees him getting ill. She sees him losing all his money. She sees his family dying from various illnesses. Every single thing that could go wrong has gone wrong because God is testing him, right? God is testing him to see his true faith. And Job doesn't fight back. Job just sits there and takes it on the chin. So she looks down on him scornfully. And that's a great painting by Georges de la Tour. Georges de la Tour could get away with the subtlety of impersonation, if you like, or that impression of Job. That's this kind of psychological contest where all you see in the end is the ruined old man. But in the Middle Ages, you couldn't leave it at that, could you? You had to find something more tangibly and immediately evil. And the image of the devil needed to start accumulating these horrible features. So the dragony stuff is kind of fairly easy to understand because I guess if you've got a snake in the Garden of Eden, anything to do with snakes and reptiles can easily be latched on to this devilish figure and to be seen as a characteristic of his. And as I said, the idea of the horns and the cloven feet and all that, right? That's directly taken from Pan, isn't it? The wicked god Pan, who was sexually unstoppable, who ravished everybody he could come near, and who was a force of evil and naughtiness and decadence. So the devil starts taking on those features. And I've got a painting I want to talk about, which I think sort of shows the devil in that kind of guise, if you like, which is to say a devil quite a long way down the road of looking immediately awful and devilish. And it's a painting by an artist I really adore called Bartolomeo Bermejo. And he's a Spanish artist of the middle of the 16th century. He painted in a style that is usually known as Hispano-Flemish, because as you know, the Netherlands were basically being ruled by the Spanish monarchs. So there was a low union between these two cultures, and a lot of Flemish artists went to Spain, a lot of Spanish artists went the other way, etc. So he learned to paint in the Flemish manner, which meant it could be very realistic. And he painted this picture, which now hangs again in our National Gallery in London, but which used to hang in this place called Taos, the Church of St. Michael, near Valencia. And when I read about it, I thought, well, I must go and see this place, Taos. That sounds really interesting. And I can't imagine, looking on a map, it was somewhere very small. Why on earth would they have this fantastic painting by Bermejo there of St. Michael slaying this very satanic monster? And I got there, and it didn't exist anymore, Taos. It had been flooded to create a reservoir, right? So it was just a big pool of water in the mountains. And just in the middle was a little church tower popping up, just the very, very top of a church. So you had to kind of imagine what the church looked like. And it was in this middle of this pool of water. And that's where this painting used to hang. It was part of a triptych originally. So yes, it's St. Michael, this heroic archangel striding on this crazy figure. The donor kneeling on the left, but he's sort of incidental, really. He's just there to make St. Michael look very big. And then at the archangel's feet is this very weird and almost, I would say, almost comic monster. I don't know about you, Bendy, but there's something almost delightful about Bermejo's devil. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's really pushing the boundaries, isn't it? Because as you said, art at this time really starts to have great fun with the devil. Art is particularly didactic at this moment. It needs to warn and terrify people about the religious meanings of all the things they're being taught about in church and reading in scriptures. And the devil, in this instance, becomes almost so kind of stereotypically bad. It's almost ridiculous, isn't it?
It is. It is. I mean, what is he? I mean, he's got some kind of awful extraterrestrial head, gigantic mouth with shark's teeth in it. It makes jaws look like a fish wearing dentures. He's got these burning yellow eyes, weird reptilian ears. And the weirdest thing, I think, for me is that he's got a metallic-looking chest, but his nipples seem to be made... I mean, he's either got two eyes in his breasts, or he's got these nipples made out of sort of burning amber or something, and a big tail that's wrapped around the bottom of St. Michael's feet. Absolutely reptilian. And this grotesque leg that looks like a chicken leg you see sometimes being eaten in restaurants in China, sticking out the bottom. So he is absolutely fiendish, and a devil that has zero good points to make physically. I think absolutely horrible thing. A real monster. And if he does anything in this picture, it's show off what a handsome figure St. Michael the Archangel was in comparison, and indeed the donor. But it's a fairy tale devil, isn't it? And you couldn't really go much further in the direction of making the devil look ridiculous. And of course, it takes us right to the cusp of the Bosch country, doesn't it? Bosch and his devil have this same element of fantasy and an invention about them. And that, again, is the great thing. You see, the devil was a shapeshifter. The devil could be anything. So why not pile in as many monsters as you can into one image and just invent these crazy, crazy things, a la Hieronymus Bosch, a la, in this case, Bermejo, and just call it the devil, because it's a great artistic freedom. Surrealism before its time. Paint whatever you want and just call it the devil.
Yes, and I wonder if people at the time probably would have been much more moved and terrified by these images than we are now in our modern secular future, where we just laugh at them. But, Wild, I'm going to show you another picture of the devil from around this time, which is also in the National Gallery. And this is a picture which the National Gallery bought recently for about £20 million, actually, painted in about 1510. We don't know who painted it. It's just called The Virgin and Child with Saints Louis and St. Margaret. It's a knockout painting. I mean, it cost 20 million because it is exceptional. But the fun part of the picture for us is that underneath the knees of St. Margaret, who's here on the right, we see a devil who I think is probably the most ridiculous devil in Western painting I've seen. Whoever painted it tried to make it look scary. He's got really sharp, blood-dripping teeth. His mouth is open, and he's got these sort of horns and spikes pointing out of his head, and scales everywhere, and terrifying wings. But it looks to me a bit like someone in a gimp mask, don't you think? It just the features are quite human-like, and I just think it's so over the top. It looks completely absurd. Does it scare you at all?
It doesn't scare me, but then I've seen the Bermejo one, and I spend this podcast looking across at you, so I've seen all sorts of horrors on the screens.
I'm not wearing a gimp mask. I just like to say for listeners.
No, it is such an extraordinary painting. I can't believe that they haven't put an artist's name to it. It's such an outstanding work, and I agree with you about that. I mean, somebody was muttering something about Hugo van der Goes when I was going round. When they reopened the museum, they mentioned it, but I don't know. It is a very, very imaginative and crazy version of that. I mean, it's a bit like, in the 1950s when everybody started believing in extraterrestrials and things coming down from Mars and the world being invaded by other beings. And they started to try and invent extraterrestrials for us, didn't they? What did aliens look like? And they came in a vast range as well, didn't they, of shapes and sizes. Sometimes they were little green men, but they could also be blobs or Daleks or strange sort of amoeboid things that grew like triffids. And it's a wonderful freedom, just as people had this extraordinarily good fun trying to invent extraterrestrials in the 1950s. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, they had the same kind of fun inventing these increasingly weird and demonic Satans.
Yeah. Can I just set out the narrative of the picture? Because I think it actually takes the story of the devil in art on another level. It's really interesting. This particular devil we see in the gimp mask underneath the feet of St. Margaret on the right. Now, St. Margaret of Antioch, she's one of those saints who resisted the idea of being married off to some Roman chief or prince, and therefore had to be fed to the devil. And because she had a cross in her hand, she was able to burst free from the devil's guts, and that's kind of the aftermath of that we're seeing in this picture here. But what's really interesting is that on the left-hand side of the painting, we have the figure of St. Louis. Now, St. Louis, he's wearing the royal robes of a French king, the fleur-de-lis, because he was King Louis IX of France. And I'm glad earlier you mentioned, Wild, the story of St. Michael, because one of the reasons we know that the figure on the left is St. Louis, King Louis IX, is that he's wearing around his neck the Order of St. Michael. And you can see, if you zoom in on the jewel here, you can see the figure of St. Michael slaying the dragon, the devil in this case, with his spear. In this image, we've got two representations of the devil as a dragon. And I think it's really interesting that St. Louis, can you see he's got his hand out there? So he's kind of keeping the devil down underneath St. Margaret's feet. And this takes us to yet another layer of interpretation of the devil's role in art and society at this time. And this was to represent basically the idea of rebellion. So one of the things that really fires people's imagination of the devil at this moment is from Dante's Inferno. Okay, so in Dante's, the poem in the Inferno, you've got 9 circles of hell, right? And at the bottom, the very hellish most circle is the devil himself. And Dante describes the devil as being kind of dragon-like, and he's got 3 heads. And in each of his heads, Dante's devil is chewing the following people. One is Judas, who obviously betrays Christ, and the other 2 are Brutus and Cassius, who betrayed Caesar. So can you see what's going on here? There's this idea of the devil being linked to this idea of sedition. And in this painting, you've got St. Louis representing royal authority, helping to keep the devil down. And the message was that in order to stop the devil ruining your life and taking you to hell, you not only had to obey the church's teachings and the church's authority, but you had to obey royal authority too. So there are so many political and theological meanings coming along at this moment.
And of course, the other product of that kind of thinking is that peoples that love rebels, people who admire the whole idea of rebellion, people who are set against the kings and the churches and the authorities, began to look at the devil as a kind of heroic figure. So Satan, the hero. And this is something that's even going on today. You know, Satanists and people who believe in all that kind of stuff, they tend to think of the devil today and Satan as a rebellious hero, rather than anything evil.
Yes, well, this is a great moment to introduce actually one of my heroes, as you know, the great English artist Sir Thomas Lawrence. When he wants to paint the devil, he goes for exactly this mood that you're describing, and he focuses on John Milton's great poem, Paradise Lost, the 17th century poem, which I think you've already mentioned. And Milton, he conjures up this idea of the devil being a beautiful, classical, heroic figure, because in large part, as you say, he wants to help people understand why the devil might be this attractive, rebellious figure who eventually then wants to join the force of evil and lead the world into corruption. So I'm going to focus on, just very briefly, a picture that Lawrence exhibits in 1797, right, at the Royal Academy, and it's called Satan Summoning His Legions. And it came with a quote, and it was from Book 1 of John Milton's Paradise Lost. And this is the moment when Satan is summoning his legions from hell. You can see beneath at the bottom of the picture here a glimpse into hell. And the quote is, "Awake, arise, or forever be fallen." Now, this painting, just to describe it for listeners, it's 14 feet tall. And you've got Satan wearing a kind of Roman classical helmet, and he's completely naked otherwise, apart from a sword. And you're looking, the only way to describe it is you're looking right up at his crotch. Now, because we're dealing with the late 18th century, you can't actually see his meat and 2 veg. That's kind of covered by a piece of gauze that's just magically blown in. But it's a rather unsettling picture, and it didn't please critics at the time. One of them, who was called Pasquin, described it as conveying the idea of a mad German baker dancing naked in his own treacle. I don't mean to be rude about German bakers, but it is an unsettling picture. You can see what he's getting at. But the point is, well, it takes us almost back to the beginning of our story, and the idea that the devil, he's lost all his horns, he's lost his wings, he's lost his cloven feet, and he is this kind of almost perfect masculine figure because he was the angel who's being cast down to heaven. And so Lawrence is trying to play with that ideal. And this is, of course, the moment, particularly in British art, when artists and audiences were encouraged to see the kind of the classical form, and so statues like the Apollo Belvedere, as this ideal of human perfection. So I think Lawrence is playing with the idea of the devil as formally a perfect human being on a number of levels, both theological and aesthetic.
And political, because he then could go on to become almost a political figure in his rebelliousness, who stands against authority, stands against established order, and leads wild and free-spirited people towards a new kind of freedom. And of course, the Romantic poets were always writing about that, weren't they?
Yeah. John Milton himself, of course, had been a leading opponent of Charles I and had supported the execution of Charles I. So there are so many layers of meaning going on here. But unfortunately, none of this helped make the picture a success. And it was really sort of, for a long time, it was British art's kind of dirty little secret. Nobody really knew what to do with it. And if you go and see, you can still go and see it at the Royal Academy today. And it's so big, you can't miss it. But nobody really wants to celebrate it. And I think I can understand why, as much as I love Sir Thomas Lawrence.
You know what it's missing? There's something obvious that's missing from it.
What's that?
Swan. It needs a swan. It needs a swan. You
Give me
and
time,
Lawrence,
Weld. Give me time, I'll find
Lawrence and swans, you'll find someone in there. I tell you, the devil could take any form. I bet he's been a swan in his time, and he's probably somewhere lurking in the background here. Listen, all that's fascinating. I want to take you on what for me is the kind of final step of the journey, really. This evolution of Satan through all these different types of imagery. So we've talked about all the things he's been, except perhaps the most significant of all of them, which is a woman. We haven't talked about the devil as a female figure, a feminine characteristic. And I want to focus on a painting that sets him up in this kind of way. And it's called Lady Lilith, and it's by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, so the notorious pre-Raphaelite. And it was painted through various stages, actually. He started painting it in 1866, but didn't finish it till about a decade later, when he changed the face of the woman from one of his mistresses to a more recent model. So it becomes more exquisite as it develops. But the basic idea is, we've got the Lady Lilith here, a typical pre-Raphaelite stunner or beauty, and she's reclining in a kind of bower surrounded by roses. She's looking in a mirror, which of course is always a sign of vanity, isn't it? But the thing that really makes her stand out is her hair. So she has got this red hair cascading off her. She's combing it as we look in the mirror. She's staring into the mirror, combing her hair. And underpinning this picture is this terrified Victorian idea of woman's sexual power, and above all, the power of women's hair. Now, I said it's a Victorian idea, but it's a lot longer lasting than that, isn't it? Why do nuns wear wimples and cover up their hair? Why are certain Islamic societies so afraid of women showing their hair? Why does the Virgin Mary in every picture you've ever seen not show her hair? Why is the only woman at the foot of the cross who shows her hair the former prostitute Mary Magdalene? I'll tell you why. Because in the masculine imagination, women's hair has come to represent this entangling force, this temptation that can't be resisted. And so that's what's going on in the psychological underpinning of this fantastic portrait by Rossetti. And in fact, there's a poem, it's a translation of a bit of Faust by Shelley, which I think spells it out. You've recited a little bit of Dante. Let me do a little bit of Shelley. Beware of her fair hair, for she excels all women in the magic of her locks. And when she twines them round a young man's neck, she will never ever set him free again. So, where are we? Well, we're back at the Garden of Eden on one level, aren't we? We're back at this idea that Eve was the great temptress who led man astray and led to original sin, seduced him and had us all thrown out of paradise. And that blurs very easily with early ideas of Satan, but also with this character called Lilith. Now, do you know anything about Lilith, Bendor?
I don't know.
Okay, well, Lilith, according to Judean scriptures, was Adam's first wife. So God created Adam and Lilith, but then Lilith wanted to dominate Adam. And the story is that when they were having sex, she wanted to go on top, but so did he. And so she was the one that won, and because of that, she left him because he wouldn't let her go on top. She left him, left paradise, and ended up with another demon called Samuel, and then started a demonic race with Samuel, leaving Adam alone in paradise. Later on, God helped him out by picking one of his ribs and turning her into Eve, right? But Lilith is this weird, ambiguous, and it can't be said universal, but occasionally appearing figure in the scriptures of the evil woman. And she is the prototype of all sorts of satanic women who are either embodiments of the devil himself or of women's power over men and therefore the reasons behind the original sin, or they're just these ideas of wickedness imagined by the fearful Western mind. And this is a great example of it. And as I said to you, it's been painted in two stages because originally the model for it was a woman called Fanny Cornforth, who was the first sort of lover and model of Rossetti's. But then later on, he gave her up and found another model called Alexa Wilding, and she's more beautiful. She's also got this more abundant red hair, so he repainted it. But look at it. It's the classic femme fatale, the classic idea of the woman who traps you. And a lot of Rossetti's art is like that. And other artists went on to these ideas. I mean, do you know what a succubus is, for example? A succubus.
I remember you telling me about a succubus through a painting by Henry Fuseli. He was very keen on succubuses.
I was, yes, I mean, we're all keen on succubuses as long as they don't come anywhere near us, right? So the succubus is the female incubus. Incubus is the male demon who sits on your chest when you're asleep at night and sucks the semen out of you. But the succubus does it even more, and it's a female demon, right? She comes down at night, and then she does terrible things to you, kills your children, and eats all your sperm. And there's a sculpture called the Succubus by Rodin. I don't know if you know it, but it's a strange but also a very direct image of a female succubus going about her business. Let's just say that the initials B and the initial J may be being implied here. But it's naughty stuff, and it's, of course, it's all to do with this idea that the devil and sexuality, right? They go together like bread and butter. You know, like the devil is always somehow or other tied in with ideas of naughtiness and sexuality. Ever since the Garden of Eden, we feared our own desires, our own impulses, and the uncontrollability that they have. And we're so scared of our inner desires and all that one of the things that we've decided to attach it to is this satanic idea of the devil. So Rossetti's Lilith, Adam's first wife, this scary figurine, there she is with her hair waiting to entrap us all. So what do you think of that? So it's a great painting, isn't it? But spooky.
Yeah, I genuinely didn't know that about Lilith and being on top. Is that actually in the Bible, or is this later Christian tradition?
It's not in the Bible. She's not in the Bible. She's in these Judaic, it's a pre-Christian Judaic ideas, originally descended from Mesopotamia, and the whole Euphrates idea of these women goddesses who represented evil. So she's much older in a way than Eve, but she's insistent and sometimes gnomic presence. And she became a kind of feminist hero, a feminine hero in the 19th century, and above all in the 20th century, when women took her up as a kind of liberating figure, in much the same way as Satan himself was taken up as a liberating figure. So she's mysterious, but you don't want to encounter her, and you never turn your back on her, Bendy. Never.
No, well, anyway, I don't know if listeners can hear me shifting uneasily in my seat as we get into the various Kama Sutric aspects of Satanism. But this is a family show, well, so I don't know. I feel perhaps we've been diabolical enough there. What do you think?
I think we've put it this way. I want to sleep tonight. I want to sleep comfortably in my bed. I don't want to have succubuses coming down and doing all the sort of bendy stuff on me. So yeah, I've had enough of that. But what a wonderful discussion we've had, and it's such an interesting topic, isn't it? I love this idea that art had to invent the devil and came up with so many different forms for it. And of course, anybody who's listening who wants to see these ghastly devils we've been talking about, please watch us on the YouTube channel. So that's YouTube, the ZCZ channel. You can watch Bendy and I in real life. You can see me raising a glass to toast your health wherever you are out there in the international world. And by the way, if you do watch us on YouTube, or indeed if you're listening to us on any of the normal podcast stations, please subscribe, because it helps us a lot if we can build our subscriber base. It makes these things possible. But you're all wonderful people, and I hope you've enjoyed what we've been talking about. And I also recommend you look up Bendy riding around on his bike in his tight leathers, finding out about art, because that's also good. But from me, bye-bye.
And goodbye from me. See you all next week.
Waldy and Bendy.